Welcome back to Weekend Agenda. Time now for our Saturday panel. Ebony Bennett from the Australia Institute joining us from Canberra. Evan Mulholland from the Institute of Public Affairs. Welcome to you both. Let's go straight to the energy debate, or what passed for it, that we have seen over the past week. Evan Mulholland, I was intrigued on Wednesday to hear the Prime Minister tell Parliament that energy policy had let Australians down for quite a long time. I would have thought it was more the policy makers than the policy. Policy's not a person, the policy makers are. It's in their hands, is it not? And they have let Australians down over the past decade.
Well, yeah, it's a very interesting debate indeed. I think if you asked your random punter on the street what the difference was between a clean energy target and a renewable energy target, I think most would be unable to tell you. I'm not surprised by polling this week that found that most voters actually trust Labor to keep the power bills down. I think this is why it's so important for Malcolm Turnbull to be able to differentiate himself from Labor policy. He should be out there saying we're going to freeze or abolish the renewable energy target. We're not going to go ahead with a clean energy target. And we're very encouraged to bring your power bills down and put more baseload power into the energy market.
Is there a danger, though, Evan, that the record rather than rhetoric will be what counts come the next election? That is that the government seems to be pretty satisfied with itself in where it's got Labor on the question of the cost of energy, but it'll be 5-6 years since the coalition came to power, and it's what happened in that time. It's the power bills that people are facing at the time of the election, not what may or may not have happened before 2013.
Yeah, I mean, this is what they've got to do. They've got to ensure that they have a record to go on. Well, obviously, after the coalition was elected, they abolished the carbon tax. We saw power bills come down after then, but we're seeing them increasingly rise. And I think it's because you've got this massive renewable energy target that mandates government picking winners into the market. I think this week we saw an extraordinary intervention by Michael Schellenberger, the famous renewables energy advisor to Barack Obama, who claimed in the Australian context the renewable energy experiment had failed, the rush to renewables had failed. If we're going to wean ourselves off coal and gas, which many on the Green left want to, we're going to have to look at options like nuclear energy in this country in order to do that. If that's the place we want to go with our energy policy, we need to look at new ways like this to provide baseload power and provide affordable energy in Australia.
Ebony Bennett, your view of what Evan's just said?
Well, I think if we're having a debate about energy prices, nuclear is the last thing you would ever want to build. It is the most expensive form of new energy, and it doesn't exist anywhere in the world without massive government subsidies. And the real nightmare scenario for business would be to scrap the renewable energy target and implement a dirty energy target, because we've had a decade of investment uncertainty that's delayed investment in new energy generation because business doesn't know which way the government is going to jump. What they need is a clear signal that Australia is moving away from fossil fuels to meet its Paris targets, and we're not going to get that, and business is not going to have any certainty to invest in anything, whether it be nuclear, coal, gas, renewables or energy storage, if the coalition continues to flap about like a fish out of water. It's horrible for consumers, for business, and it has to stop. And AEMO this week made clear that we don't have to extend the life of, for example, Liddell. We've got more notice about that plant closing than we've had for anything else, and it can be replaced by a combination of demand response. It can be replaced by renewable energy, and there's lots of other alternatives. And if we are going to refurbish any kind of power plant, Liddell's the last one that you would want to replace. It's old, it's operating mostly at half its capacity, and it would cost a fortune. It's got a liability for rehabilitation of almost $1 billion. So the coalition needs to get its act together and decide what it's going to do on energy policy, quick, smart.
Yes, Evan, as a free marketeer, would you be comfortable with the application of hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayers' money to guarantee the reliability of Liddell into the future, if that's what it takes, because it doesn't appear that unless these anonymous benefactors that seem to be in the wings or are claimed to by the government are prepared to take it all on themselves, that a place like Liddell is going to have its life extended without a great deal of money from the taxpayer.
Well, I'm uncomfortable with any taxpayer funding going to any form of energy, whether it be snowy hydro, whether it be coal plants, or whether it be the $3 billion of subsidies the renewable industry gets each year. I think it's important to focus on the real issue here in the energy, the elephant in the room, if you would, and it's that state governments, Labor state governments mostly, are locking up gas in this country. You've got a crazy situation here in Victoria where Daniel Andrews has locked up both conventional and unconventional gas, and it was an extraordinary admission by Bill Shorten this week saying that the conventional gas should be ban in Victoria should be lifted, and I think that's an important step to make. I'd go even further and say all states should be looking into gas exploration in this country. In America, even Barack Obama admitted that it was onshore gas exploration that revived the economy in America. And I think we need to be looking at that here. We need to be looking at more ways we can get more gas into the energy market.
Ebony, just before we leave this subject, the one success that Malcolm Turnbull has had in this debate so far, and it may turn out to be of benefit to him down the track, is that instead of this being an argument about the type of energy we use, it's become one about the price, and that is a very, very significant shift, I would have thought, but also one that's entirely understandable given what has happened to power prices for consumers in this country over the past decade.
Absolutely. It's no wonder people are concerned about this, because power prices have risen dramatically. Tony Abbott promised getting rid of the carbon price would reduce them. It hasn't done anything of the sort. We've had gold plating of poles and wires.
It did initially, but not in the longer term.
That's true, but in some cases we've had gold plating of the financial assets of energy companies. Privatisation hasn't really worked. But again, underpinning it all is this lack of investment certainty that's created problems in terms of supply and giving a clear direction to the market about where they should invest their money in the long term. But what I think we're going to see in the short term, if we are focusing on prices, is much more efficient responses like demand response, where the market will pay people to reduce the amount of energy. It will pay companies to reduce the amount of energy that they use at peak times. And that's technology that's available to roll out almost as soon as this summer. It's far cheaper, it's far more effective than replacing or refitting old coal-fired power stations. But it's something that we haven't talked about enough. But I do think after 2 years, or several years, I guess, of coalition governments, price, I think they think it's their strong ground, but they're advocating things that are going to cost a fortune and will do nothing to put downwards prices on energy, the same way that renewable prices, we know, put downwards pressure on energy prices. The government's own review, the Warburton Review, found that. That is where the market is heading, whether or not the government likes it. And we just need a clear signal so there can be bipartisan support for moving away from fossil fuels in the long term. It doesn't have to be within the next 5 years, but we've got to make a decisive shift, and it has to have bipartisan support.
We had better move on. Evan, this week also marked the second anniversary of the Prime Ministership of Malcolm Turnbull. Hardly surprisingly, it was a pretty muted celebration. You'd have to say, would you not, that those who voted for him would be pretty disappointed at least at this stage, with the way things have turned out over the past year or 2 years?
I wouldn't say they were disappointed. I think Tony Abbott probably most certainly would have lost the previous election. I think Malcolm Turnbull has done a reasonable job under the circumstances. Obviously, a one-seat majority is a pretty ragged situation to be in. There's a lot more for him to do. He's done a lot of good things. He's restored the ABCC and the Registered Organisations Commission. This week we saw him achieve a major achievement, which is media reform in this country. Long awaited. You had a media reform legislation that was drafted in 1987, before I was born. And it didn't recognise the age of the internet, or didn't recognise that cable TV existed. And the government's been able to come in, liberalise our media laws into the 21st century. They've gotten through a lot of things they think has worked for them, albeit whether it be Gonski, whether it be welfare reforms. I think a lot of the things they're doing in the welfare space are quite good, but we've still got $500 billion of debt in this country, and I think the Turnbull government's got a long way to go to both differentiate himself from Labor and get the government on the right track towards the election.
Might come to media reform in a moment, but Ebony, before we leave this subject, do you think that Malcolm Turnbull can get out from under? One of the things that's always occurred to me is that governments always have the ability to do things, whereas oppositions can only talk about what they're going to do. It's also noteworthy that while Labor has been in a winning position for a very long time in the polls, the public has not particularly warmed to Bill Shorten, and that often suggests to me that the support that you're seeing for the party is in fact that of a protest against and a referendum on the government, rather than a positive endorsement of the opposing force.
Yeah, that could be the case. I think the public has really strongly reacted to some of the bolder policy visions that the Labor Party has put out, things like tackling capital gains tax discount and negative gearing. I think they've not pursued a small target strategy, and it has paid off for the party. I do think Turnbull has had some successes. I think the bank levy is wildly popular, for example. He's made a really good start on superannuation changes. But I do think it's lacking in vision, this government, compared to the Labor Party, mostly because of all the internal fighting by Tony Abbott and a small group within the coalition backbench who are constantly agitating on things that distract from what Malcolm Turnbull, I think, would like to be focused on, and take the debate down these radical fringe ends like the Racial Discrimination Act and abolishing the Human Rights Commission like Tony Abbott was talking about today. I mean, no one could sensibly pursue those kinds of policies. The only reason Tony Abbott thinks that's a good idea is because he's never faced any serious discrimination in his life. The Human Rights Commission, for example, that's constantly the whipping boy of coalition governments, one of its key functions is anti-discrimination law, and it prevents people from having to go to court when women get fired for being pregnant, for example, when people aren't offered jobs because they're Aboriginal or otherwise discriminated against. They actually serve quite a core function apart from reports, but it's these kinds of distractions that take away from what the Turnbull government and what the Prime Minister is trying to achieve. I mean, it's week in, week out at this point.
Evan, media reform, you may not have been born when the laws were last changed. I was, and indeed I was reporting, remember it well, princes of print, queens of screen, etc., etc. But do you think that the laws, as they are now likely to change, the end of the 2 out of 3 rule, the 75% reach rule, will really produce more diversity within the Australian media landscape?
I think it will. The media laws enable media companies to configure themselves in ways that they see fit. I think you might see things like Fairfax joining with Nine and other media mergers around, a flurry of media mergers around. I think the 2 out of 3 rule is a really important achievement here. I mean, the 75% reach rule most TV networks break that rule already, like iView, etc. So it's important to get rid of that as well. The $60 million, the kerfuffle over the $60 million handout, I think, was disappointing, and a few other things added on with that. You had a bizarre situation where you had people like Senator Dastyari and the Greens, often big advocates against multinational companies, advocating that we give cash to places like the New York Times, which just posted a $35 million profit, and BuzzFeed, which is valued at $1.25 billion. The fact that we should be giving them money, I think it's bizarre that they're calling for more state intervention in the media market. We need to liberalise our media market, which the government has done, and I think that's a very good thing.
Whatever else, Ebony Bennett, the laws did need overhaul, and with Labor in particular, but also the Greens effectively absenting themselves from the debate, simply opposing whatever was being proposed, it was almost inevitable that the result we ended up getting was what happened.
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, the government does go to the crossbench in those situations, and we've seen both One Nation and the Nick Xenophon team deal themselves into this. But two things I think are concerning. There's definitely reason to update and revise media laws, that's for sure. But the 2 out of 3 rule is important, and I think we are going to see, it's inevitable, the whole reason to get rid of it is to have a further concentration of media ownership. We're going to see mergers, whether or not in the next year or 2 or longer than that. That is absolutely going to be the end game. And the other thing that is very concerning out of this debate is, I think, the attack on the ABC. Public broadcasting in this media landscape, where no one has cracked the new business model for journalism, is going to be more important than ever. And One Nation and this inquiry, I think, is the start of a thin end of the wedge for further attacks on the ABC, for political parties trying to intervene and change the ABC's charter to attack its funding, and I think that's really concerning. The ABC is one of the only places now that devotes serious attention to, for example, investigative journalism, plays a really important role in rural and regional Australia, and I think it's really concerning that we're going to see further attacks on the ABC, particularly in the lead up to the next budget.
We will have to leave it there, and for once at least, this has been a same-sex marriage-free zone. Can't promise it's going to be that way every weekend, but for now, thank you very much, Ebony Bennett from the Australia Institute and Evan Mulholland from the Institute of Public Affairs. See you soon.